Folks, welcome into the museum today. My name is Jeremy. I'm the MC here on the floor. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll endeavor to answer whatever you've got. Today what we're working on is, if you can see the lighted platforms on either side, the right and left, you can see the goblets that the Hot Shop team has made, and immediately adjacent to those are those blue vessels. What the team here is working on is dragon forms that are going to serve as stoppers for the tops of those blue bottles, be used later in an event later this year. So currently here at the center bench, we're working through the process and sequencing of making these dragon forms. And we're doing it here in clear glass because the finished product is going to be either red, which is the color red is made out of gold oxide, so you can see the correlation to the price point there. And then the stems themselves, you can see the yellowish kind of coloring to the dragon stems that we have. Those are actually rolled in gold foil. So in an attempt to lower cost, make sure that our production is on point before we actually start rolling in those expensive materials, we're going through that process to understand the sequence and make sure that we've got it right. So you see that back and forth between that rewarming chamber and the bench. You're going to be taking those trips back and forth. You've got to keep that glass at a good workable temperature. And even more important than that, you have to keep that connection point in between our glass form and the rod on which it sits above 1,000 degrees. If it drops below 1,000 degrees, that glass can crack, and then we'll lose all of our work. So from time to time, our artist there on the bench will stand up and move to that rewarming chamber. That rewarming chamber runs at 2,300 degrees. It's powered by natural gas and forced air, and it runs for the time that we are here in the hot shop working on the floor. You contrast that with our crucibles. We have two crucibles on the floor. One is to the right side, one on the left. The one on the left is currently being replaced and so is out of service. But that crucible on the right-hand side of the studio, that holds 1,000 pounds of glass in a molten state, right about 2,100 degrees, and that runs 24/7. Again, that crucible runs on natural gas and forced air, just like the rewarming chamber does. And that holds all of our clear glass. Here in the museum, we only put clear glass in our crucibles. We add the color to our forms using a number of different techniques. But for this morning, we're going to be using clear glass exclusively. All right, folks, so we saw that piece end up on the floor. The reason that they did that is the lead gaffer in the bench isn't exactly happy with the proportions of that particular item. He was talking about the chest being a little bit too big and the mane needing to be changed. And so what they're going to do is another version of that, again, in clear glass, to get that the sequencing and the proportions just right. Once they're happy with that, then they will actually go into the production style using the color, adding the gold leaf and things like that. So after that gather of hot glass on the end of our punty rod, we've put that deep into an optic mold, essentially embossing the surface and giving some texture to that glass glob that is there on that rod. I'm going to tweeze that out and refine that shape just a little bit. In this particular case, working through some experimentation. All right, so we've got those vertical lines up and down the body of what is going to become our dragon form. What we're going to do now is we're going to add a wrap to go around the outside of it. Kind of gives us a little bit of a scaly look to it once we get it into the crucible and melt all of that into the surface of the glass. It will not become perfectly smooth because glass does have memory. In this particular case, you're going to see the embossed surface of that glass. Oh, no. You can see there what happens when the temperature differential is just a little too much. That wrap on the outside didn't end up sticking, so we got to get it nice and hot so those two bits of glass close enough in temperature that they will stick together. Glass has a hard time sticking to anything that isn't hot. And in this particular case, we've got to get that glass up to temperature so that they bind together. So we can ditch that prototype and go back into the crucible for another gather of glass. We'll start working it over again. You see Ben, our head gaffer, is there rolling that hot gather of glass back and forth across our big steel table. That steel table is called a marver, and historically it's been made out of marble. But other studios around the United States have different versions in stainless steel like ours, marble, copper, and brass. And with Ben happy with the chill and the dimensions of that initial gather, he's going to add another layer, going to add another gather of glass to the outside of it. And because we're not using a blowpipe in this particular case, we're using a solid rod, the volume dimensions of our form, they're dependent solely upon the amount of glass that we're able to put on the outside of that pipe, because we cannot inflate it from the inside. Using that bladed metal tool called the jacks, put a couple of constrictions into the form. And then with a combination of tweezers and those diamond shears, we're able to pull that glass into a much longer, thinner, and more refined shape. Glass gets a little chilled. We've got to get back into that rewarming chamber. Again, 2,300 degrees internal temperature. And when our gaffer is happy with the amount of heat he's got in his glass form, he returns to the bench and continues to shape up. We've got our intern brought that hot glob of glass over. Now we're running that lip wrap again that we ran last time. This time we're using that MAP gas container to give us a little bit more thermal energy and hope that that glass actually binds to the stem or the dragon body's form. And then back into the rewarming chamber to make sure that the wrap we just added fuses perfectly with the glass underneath it. And once Ben is happy with that, he'll move back to the bench and continue refining that shape. Folks, if you're just joining us here on the Hot Shop floor, what we're working through now is the process by which our artists here are going to make the stoppers for the blue decanter bottles that you see on these lit up plinths in front of you. We're going to be doing an event later on in the year, and we're working to tie both of these goblets and the decanters together. So this morning we're working through that process, making sure that the entire team understands the sequence of the events that need to happen, making sure that the dimensions of those stoppers are perfect. And once our team is happy with that, then we'll actually go into full production mode where we start adding color to the glass forms that we're working. Right now, we're working strictly with clear glass, making sure that our process is 100% before we move on to the expensive stuff. So if you see a piece after some deliberation get chopped off and knocked onto the floor, that's why artist in the bench wasn't exactly happy with what we were doing. We think we've gone through 7 or 8 of them this morning, and still working through that process, but we'll get there eventually. Currently, we're working on dragon forms. We have started out with a gather of hot glass on a solid rod, shaped up the main portion of the body, tweaked the tail around a bit, and then transferred that to another solid rod. So now we are attached at the tail, and we will be adding bits for wings, spines, and a head. In this particular case, it looks like we're going to be adding a wing to the side of our dragon form. And with the addition of that bit, we'll get our dragon form back into that rewarming chamber. Meanwhile, another member of our team goes back into the crucible. Remember, that crucible holds 1,000 pounds of molten glass, 2,100 degrees, running 24/7. And when we're happy with the amount of glass on that gather, we come back to the center bench. We present it to the gaffer, who will then add it to the dragon form and continue refining that shape. All right, folks, it looks like that prototype was just perfect enough to be put away and used a little bit later. Right now, we've got it here in this big silver box on the left-hand side of the studio. That silver box is called the garage. Kind of like your garage at home. We use it for all our spare parts and projects on which we're working. One thing that folks don't know about the garage, it has a hot side and a cold side. The cold side is the left. The hot side, as you're looking at it, is the right side. It's about 400 degrees hotter on the right than it is on the left. We use this garage to keep our glass forms in a ready state, but not so hot that they distort under their own weight. So it keeps the glass nice and warm, get it back into that rewarming chamber a couple of times to bring it up to temperature, and then we can continue working on it. But for the time being, we've got it sitting in a pause in that garage, and we'll address it a little bit later. If you notice very, very carefully, look closely, so if you notice, that dragon that Ben was walking around and showing everyone, that was obviously very yellow. The yellow on that comes from gold foil that our forms are rolled in at the very beginning of the process. So as they spend time in that rewarming chamber, that glass really melts into the surface and gives us obviously a very shiny gold surface that you're seeing. Gold is used in glass blowing in another form, and it produces a red pigment. So red is very often one of the most expensive glass colors for us to work in. And I think the only thing more expensive than that is that gold leaf itself that we use in this center booth here to do the application. And with that item boxed up in the garage, you take a little bit of a pause, think about some of our design aesthetics, refine that, and then we'll get back to making our glass stoppers. So we're going to begin our design process by using a solid rod called a punty rod. We're going to put some glass on the end of that. It's called a gather. And then with that gather of hot glass at the end of our punty rod, we're going to shape it up using the marvering table. I'm going to roll it back and forth and draw a lot of that glass off the end of that punty rod. I'm going to let it chill just a bit. Gives us more surface area to add another layer of hot glass, which is what we're going to be doing here in just a moment. A crucible that we use. We have two of them here on the hot shop floor, one on the left side of the studio, which is currently out of service, and we've got the one on the right-hand side of the studio. Now, each of those crucibles holds 1,000 pounds of glass, 2,100 degrees, and we run those 24/7. Unfortunately, we're down to about half our capacity, so we only have 1,000 pounds of glass on the floor rather than a full ton. With that new layer of hot glass, we've rolled it back and forth in that little tiny silver bowl on the marvering table. It holds a type of glass called frit, and it is nothing more than a chunk of colored glass that has been smashed up into little tiny chips. We roll that in the surface, adds a layer of color to the outside. Make sure that we get it nice and melted into the surface of that initial gather of glass. And then we've dropped it into an optic mold, which has given us some surface texture. Let me get back to the bench using a combination of our tweezers, tongs, and other bladed objects like the ones used now called the jacks. We add some constrictions and some other design elements, drawing it out, elongating the body of the dragon. All right, with that initial shape and a quick run back into the rewarming chamber, we're going to come back here to our station. We're going to add a wrap of glass around the outside of it. We got those vertical lines. We're going to add some horizontal lines, which will then give us kind of a scaly type surface that will read as scales for our dragon when it's finished. And we've added that wrap of clear glass, and we get it back into that rewarming chamber to make sure that everything is bonded nice and tight and that that wrap doesn't crack and end up on the floor. Again, that rewarming station, 2,300 degrees on the inside. No liquid glass, save for what may happen to fall off in there. It's a big metal tube lined with fire brick, runs on forced air and natural gas. And that one runs only for the duration of the time that we're here in the studio, as opposed to that crucible, which runs 24/7. And getting ready to add another bit to the bottom of this dragon form. Used a separate punty rod, added a gather of glass from our crucible, rolled it into our frit that's there on the table in that silver bowl. Back into the rewarming chamber to make sure everything's nice, hot, and liquidy, and then back to our center bench where we add that bit, snip away the excess, and then using our tweezers and tongs, we form that into a tail fin of sorts. And then back into that rewarming chamber to make sure that everything stays above 1,000 degrees. It's very, very important that connection between our punty rod and our glass form stays above 1,000. If we drop below that, we risk cracking that connection point called the moil. You got to keep that moil above 1,000 so we do not lose all of the hard work off the end of that rod. All right, back here to the center bench where we're going to do a punty transfer. We're going to move from one rod to the other. Currently, the head of that dragon form sits attached to Ben's pipe. We're getting ready to move it away from that so then we can work on the head form. You notice that our artist there at the bench created just a bit of a temperature differential at one of those constriction points, and with a tap of the rod, we use those physics to send those surface cracks all the way through the constriction point, leaving it on the other punty rod. And now we get it back into the rewarming chamber where we are now. You got to make sure that the end of the dragon form, the head on which we're starting to work, is nice and hot. If you remember, we just inverted that piece. The tail was the furthest thing from our artist. The head was the closest. The first thing into that crucible and the last thing out is the hottest portion of the glass. And because we've just inverted it and started working on the other end, we've got to bring that portion of our glass form up to temperature. So we're going to stand in front of that rewarming chamber a couple of times, bringing it up to speed. And then we get back to our bench and continue shaping up our form. All right, folks, getting ready to add another bit. So we've got a gather of glass from the crucible, a quick roll in that frit into the rewarming chamber to melt it into the surface of that gather. And when both of our artists are happy with the temperatures, we're going to bring them together. Quick snip with the shears and some attention with those tweezers. We get it back into the rewarming chamber. Add some more thermal energy into our form and then get back to the bench to add another bit. With those arms out of the way, I'm going to add some more bits again. Hot gather, rolled through the frit, and then into the rewarming chamber to make sure it all melts in. It's up to temperature. And then back to the center bench. We're going to add the mane to the neck of our dragon. And then we use those tongs to add some design elements into that before we get it back into that 2,300 degree rewarming chamber. All right, it looks like we've added that bit so we can start working on the face of the dragon. Carving in those those sculptural elements. And again, once our artist is happy with where he is at the current point, he'll get it back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over heat. Remember, folks, we got to keep that glass form above 1,000 degrees, especially the connection point between our punty rod and the form itself. If that punty rod and the temperature of that moil drop below 1,000 degrees there at the very end, we stand a pretty good chance of having the moil crack. And then we end up with all of our hard artwork, hard-earned artwork there on the floor. So that tiny little addition that we just saw, most folks missed because it's so small. They're adding eyes to that dragon form. It's kind of difficult to see at this point. But it's important to know that those eyes, just like everything else, have to be at the appropriate temperature, close to 1,000 degrees, in order for those two items to stick together. That's why we have them in our big silver box called the garage. That garage sits at about 1,000 degrees internal temperature, and it keeps our pieces nice and hot and ready, but not so hot that they will deform. Glass, hot glass likes to stick to other hot things, particularly hot glass. So we will bring those glass items up to temperature so we can ensure a good bond before we move on to the next portion of the design process. Another addition of a colored bit for a wing. And get that first wing back into the rewarming chamber. Make sure that it is bonded perfectly well. Then we'll get back to the bench, form it up, and add another to the opposite side. And there we have the initial addition of wing number 2 to our dragon form. Quick trip to the rewarming chamber, and then we'll get back to the bench, continue shaping up. Using that MAP gas container there to apply some very directed temperature, some very directed thermal energy into our form and our equipment. If you remember, I just mentioned that we've got to keep that pipe and the connection between it and our glass form above 1,000 degrees. So we added a little bit of thermal energy with that MAP gas container. Made a quick run to the rewarming chamber and then back to the bench to continue shaping.
That one would probably be usable, maybe.
So you can see that we are heating up that little shovel. Got to make sure that that shovel is not cold. If we drop that hot dragon form onto that cold pan, that cold plate, it would surely crack. So we've got to bring it up to temperature such that the glass can tolerate the temperature differential. Another run or two back into the rewarming chamber, and we will knock that piece away onto the plate and put it away for the afternoon. Tap that away. And with that, that initial dragon form will find itself in our garage. Again, that garage keeps our glass forms in a ready state at about 1,000 degrees. Keeps them hot enough that they're ready, but not so hot that they are malleable. That dragon form will retain its shape for the entire time that it's in there. And it will stay in a hot enough state that when we get ready to add the foot and the bowl to this, well, actually, I guess we're making stoppers here, so we won't be adding those. We have some additional design elements that will be needed in order to make them stoppers. So we'll put them away until we get to that point. We can work on all of them together. And with that initial piece put away, we'll begin working on form number 2. Again, you notice we are using solid punty rods. We are not using blowpipes, so we won't be pushing any air into these forms. Instead, we'll be sculpting that glass. With that initial gather, we've set our pipe there on the marvering table, letting it cool down just enough so that when we put that initial gather back into our crucible, it won't disform or change under the heat and pressure of that new gather of clear glass. And straight from the crucible into a bowl full of chipped up glass called frit. That frit, you'll see, as it cools down, becomes yellow in color, just like that last dragon form we put away. And now a dip into our optic mold to impart some of those lines, that embossed texture into the surface of our glass. Back into the rewarming chamber, and we'll get back to the bench to start the initial shaping of that dragon's body. So using a combination of that tool called the jacks that Ben is using right now, the tweezers, tongs, and other shears at the bench, we will pull that initial gather out into a longer, more serpentine shape. Set the initial dimensions of this dragon's form, this dragon's body, before we add a wrap to the outside of it, which you'll see here in the next couple of minutes. So a small gather of clear, hot glass. Very light touch. We get the initial stick. And then we rotate that pipe through those rollers, adding that layer or thread of glass around the outside so that when it sits in that rewarming chamber, it presents more of a scaly appearance on the body of our dragon's form. But we got to get it back into that rewarming chamber and just make sure that all of the glass that we added is nice and hot and has been bonded to the glass that was on the pipe just a moment ago. And then back to our bench where we will continue to refine that form. So to answer the question, which a lot of people are asking themselves, what the heck are we making here on the hot shop floor today? If you notice down here at the very front of the studio, we have a couple of lit pedestals, if you will. You can see goblets and some blue decanters. Those blue decanters and the goblets will be used in an event later this year. What we're actually doing now is creating a design element to bring those two pieces together. So we'll have the dragon form underneath the goblet itself. And what we're making now is a dragon form to act as a stopper for those decanters. So a little bit different design than what you see on the goblets there, a little bit more elaborate, a little bigger, a little more ostentatious. This bit just added will work as one of the tail fins for our dragon form. Split that in half and start adding those sculptural elements, drawing them out, tweezing them just to the right shape. Then we get it back into that rewarming chamber, keeping it above 1,000 degrees, making sure that it is in a ready state, prepared to receive the next bit of glass coming out of the crucible. Getting ready to add just a little bit of hot glass to the very end of that tail form. Gives us a little bit more meat on the bones of this dragon form so we can do what is called a punty transfer. We're on the right-hand side of the studio. We've got one of our interns making a punty rod. Again, it is on a clear or on a solid rod, all of that clear glass. Bring it back to the center bench. We'll attach that to the bottom, and then we will knock away the punty rod on the left-hand side, currently in the artist's hands. Quick tap into the rewarming chamber. And the piece that was just broken away is the coldest portion of that glass form, so we've got to let it sit inside that rewarming chamber for a couple of minutes to bring it up to a good working temperature. With that first bit added to the chest area of the dragon, we have added arm number 1. We've gotten it back into that rewarming chamber. We're going to add a little bit of more of a sculptural design to it and add arm number 2 here in just a sec. See him drawing out that hot glass, tweezing it down so we have just the finest little thread to add. So Nick just gathered up another glob of hot glass, rolled it through that yellow gold frit, went to the rewarming chamber to melt it in, and now we are back at the center bench, adding the mane down the neck of our dragon form. And again, using those tweezers and tongs, add those sculptural elements that really tell us that it's a dragon. All right, folks, so what we're doing right now is discussing the addition of a couple of eyes to this dragon form. Now, the eyes have been pre-made, and they're sitting inside this big silver box called the garage. The garage sits at about 1,000 degrees on the left-hand side, 13 to 1400 degrees on the right-hand side. We'll move it from one side, from the cold side to the hot side for a few minutes just before we get ready to add those bits to our dragon form. This is one of the things that we need to design and create ahead of time so that when it comes time to add those elements to our dragon form, they're ready to go. We don't have to create them on the fly. So we've spent some time making up dragon's eyes and then bringing them up to temperature here in our garage before we're adding them to our forms. Now that we've got those eyes added, we're going to add another bit here. And if everything holds true to form, it looks like we'll be adding a wing element. Before we do that, we pull that clear glass out of the crucible, run it through that bowl of chipped up colored glass called frit, back into the rewarming chamber to melt it into the surface of that clear gather. And once it's all nice and liquidy, we'll present it back here at the center bench. We'll add that wing form to the back of our dragon. In the same way as last time, we start with a gather of clear glass, roll it through that colored frit into the rewarming chamber, and then we'll get it back to the center bench for addition to that dragon form. All right, folks, with that tray coming out, it's a good indicator that we're about done with this dragon form. I'm going to bring that tray up to a temperature so that we don't get some cold shock when we drop it on that plate. A little quick tap, we'll separate it. And then we'll get it from there back into our garage as we talked earlier. Again, we're going to hold that in a ready state, a nice hot state, but not soft. We'll be able to use that later on in the day. And with that one boxed up, we're going to start on another one of those dragon forms for our decanters. In much the same way that we did it last time, it starts with a gather of clear glass off the end of one of those solid rods. We roll it back and forth on the marvering table, give it a little bit of shape and structure. We'll let it set up a bit before we get back into that crucible for another layer of clear glass on the outside. Add that second layer. We'll take another run through that bowl of colored glass called frit. And get it into the rewarming chamber to make sure that that frit has melted into the surface of our clear glass. And then we'll get back into our bench where we start shaping things up. So here we are at that crucible, 2,100 degrees. That's 1,000 pounds of glass in there at that temperature. It runs 24/7. Added a layer on the outside of our punty rod. Currently rolling it through that gold glass there on the table. And as I said before, into that 2,100 degree rewarming chamber, 2,300 degree rewarming chamber. We make sure that all of that newly added crushed glass melts into the surface. And with it nice and hot, I think we're going to get into that optic mold there on the floor. Give us a little texture and emboss some design elements into the surface of our glass form. And then back into that rewarming chamber to make sure everything is up to speed and temperature, and then to our bench where we start shaping things up. So now that we've got those vertical lines in and the body tweezed out into its initial form, we're going to add a horizontal wrap around the entire form so that when we're finished, it reads as though it's a scaly dragon. So we get a nice gather of clear hot glass, tack it to the surface ever so slightly, and then spin, spin, spin like our lives depend on it. All right, so what happened there, folks, is that the temperature of that wrap was not quite hot enough to bond to the surface of the dragon's body. So we've now scraped away all of that clear lip wrap or clear wrap on the outside of that dragon's form. We're going to start the process again. Again, with a nice gather of hot, clear glass straight from the crucible. I'm going to let it set up there on the edge of the marvering table so that it maintains its shape when we add another layer of clear glass from the crucible. And there we go back into the crucible. Again, 2,100 degrees. And that crucible operates 24/7 with 1,000 pounds of glass in the bowl. You take a run through that crushed up yellow glass called frit. Adds a layer of color to the outside of our dragon form. We get it into the rewarming chamber to make sure all of that frit melts into the surface. And we're going to drop that into our optic mold there on the floor. Give us those vertical stripes that you see up and down the side of our dragon forms. Quick trip to the rewarming chamber and then back to the bench where we'll start up the initial shaping process. Again, using a combination of those metal tools there on the bench, tongs, tweezers, shears, and in this case, the bladed tool called the jacks. We begin the initial shaping process, putting in constrictions and drawing out that little short, stubby gather of glass into something long and more elegant, more serpentine, if you will. All right, folks, we're going to try that wrap process again. Round and round she goes. Then back into that rewarming chamber to melt that glass into the surface. Make sure it's got a nice bond. The glass has a memory, so we won't lose that horizontal wrap that we just added entirely. It'll become a perfect addition to the surface of that dragon form. Again, enabling our dragon form to be read as scales, serpentine, once we're done with our object. that additional piece of glass we just threw on there. That's called a bit. And that bit is now being shaped into the two fins of the dragon's tail. Get our initial shape, and then back into that rewarming chamber. Then get back to the bench and we'll refine that just a bit before we add our next piece. All right, we've added just a bit of clear glass to the bottom of that dragon's tail. At the same time that's going on, we've got another one of our interns making what's called a punty rod. We're going to transfer this dragon form away from the rod it's on now onto the other one that's being created. That'll allow us to work on the head and upper body of our dragon form. Make sure that that punty rod is a good temperature, matches with what we've already got on the rod. A quick stick, make sure everything's together. Crimp with the shears and a quick tap of the rod, and away it comes. Back into the rewarming chamber so we can heat up the coldest portion of the glass now and start working on the head and neck. Get those arms added, maybe a wing or two, who knows, we'll see. Maybe a happy accident. All right, folks, getting ready to add another bit of colored glass to this dragon form. If everything holds true to our process that we've been working on, we'll see the addition of a couple of arms. Using those shears, we'll pull down, pull away the excess, giving us a very fine point that we can then add to the chest of our dragon. Those shears, we leave a little bit hanging off the end that will turn into a claw. And with that, back into the rewarming chamber. Remember, folks, the inside of that rewarming chamber runs at 2,300 degrees on forced air and natural gas. and it runs 24/7. If you contrast that with our crucibles that hold all of our glass, we have two of them here on the hot shop floor. The one on the left side of the studio is currently out of service. So we're working out of the one on the right. You can see Nick has opened that door just so slightly to pull out a gather of clear glass in preparation for the new addition. Going to roll that through that gold-colored chipped up glass called frit. And once he's happy with the surface of that frit being melted in, we'll present that bit to the center bench. Again, using those shears to pull away the excess. It gives us that little tiny thread to attach. Down, bend that elbow, and then back up to the shoulder. Leave a little bit of excess there that we can turn into a claw later. And then back into the rewarming chamber. And folks, you notice that our artist continues to get up and down, moving back and forth from the bench to the rewarming chamber. And that's because we have to keep our entire glass form above 1,000 degrees. One of the most critical portions of that form is the connection between our puntee rod and the form itself. And if that drops below 1,000 degrees, we run the very high risk of having that area crack and losing all of our hard work on the floor. So the artist will move from the bench to the rewarming chamber periodically to keep everything above 1,000 degrees. Gonna add our next bit of glass. Looks like we're gonna go for the main down the neck of our dragon form. Quick snip and some attention with those tweezers, those tongs. Add some sculptural elements into it. And again, back to that rewarming chamber, just like you've been seeing. All right, so what we're seeing here is Nick is coming from the garage here on the left-hand side of the studio and presenting a couple of eyes to be added to our dragon form. Ben wasn't quite happy with where he was in the design process, so we get back into that rewarming chamber, refine that shape a bit more, and now Nick can come back with those little tiny eyeballs. We're going to add that to the side of the dragon's face. And much like we've been seeing over and over again, we'll move from the bench back to the rewarming chamber. Nick will take that plate of dragon's eyes and put it back into the garage, where we will continue using those for the rest of the afternoon. Now that Ben has moved back to the rewarming chamber, going to make sure that the eyes we just added to that dragon form are perfectly bonded in just the right spot. And once he's happy with that, then we'll get ready to add the next few bits and finish our decanter stopper. All right, folks, that was the initial edition of Wing 1. Use those tweezers to emboss a little bit of texture into the surface. Okay, so good question. What are we making today? So what you see on the lit platforms in front of you is a combination of a couple things. Both of which will be used at an event later on this year. What they have done is they've created these goblet forms and the basics of the decanter. What they're making now is the stopper for the decanter to try and tie both objects together. Correct. Yeah. Again, folks, like we talked about, we've got to keep that connection between our punty rod and our glass form up to temperature. In this case, we've got to keep it above 1,000 degrees to keep that glass from cracking. So our artist there in the center bench is using that MAP gas container to bring the moil up to a good working temperature so that it will be receptive to this breakaway that we're going to do. We're going to knock it off of this punty rod and put it in the tray that Nick is carrying. Now you notice Nick is putting that tray into the rewarming chamber. We've got to make sure that it is nice and warm so that when we drop our dragon form into it, we don't get some cold shock and shatter our work. A quick tap, it's away. And with that, we put it into our garage for the afternoon, where it will sit at about 1,000 degrees until we're ready to add it to our next portion of this design. And with that said, looks like we're going to get into that crucible, start one more of these decanter stoppers before we take a break here for lunch. And that will start, as it has all morning, with a gather of clear glass on a solid rod. We're going to roll it back and forth across the table. The table's called the Marver. Historically, it's been made out of marble, but in our case, we've got stainless steel. In other studios around the country, around the globe, you'll see lots of other materials being used for their marvering tables: brass, copper, stainless steel, marble, etc. And now that we've got some structural integrity on that initial gather, we'll throw it back into the crucible, gathering up that 2,100 degree molten glass. And that crucible runs 24/7. Never shut it off unless we're getting ready to replace it, kind of like we're doing here on the left-hand side of the studio. We've got that clear glass. We run it through that bowl of yellow chipped up glass called frit. We move from there to our rewarming chamber to make sure all of that frit has then been melted into the surface of our gather. We'll drop it into an optic mold there on the floor. It gives us some texture, some embossed texture to the outside of the glass form that we're working on. You'll see him get it back into the rewarming chamber to add just a touch more thermal heat, and then he'll get into the bench after that. So here we are into that optic mold. Back into the rewarming chamber for an all-over heat, a quick flash, and then back to the bench where we'll start using those metal tools on the side bench to shape up and draw out our dragon form. So with this initial shape out of the way, we're going to add the wrap that goes all the way around our dragon form's body. Little gather of hot glass. We'll bring it back to our setup here. A quick touch to the outside, back it off a bit, and then we spin, spin, spin. Wrapping that around the outside, and it's not quite bonded to the surface yet. So you'll see, back into the rewarming chamber, make sure all of that wrap material is now bonded to the surface of the glass underneath. And once Ben is happy with the temperature and the way things are setting in, we'll get back to that center bench and continue shaping up our dragon. One thing I would like you folks in the audience to appreciate is the thermometer there right in front of our rewarming chamber. Currently sitting at about 105, 110 degrees. It's important for our artists to stay hydrated here on the floor. Going to add that bit to the tail, snip it in half, and start turning that into a couple of the tail fins for our dragon form. Then back into the rewarming chamber, give it an all-over flash heat. Make sure that it stays up to temperature. So it not only stays on our punty rod, but the hot glass that we're going to add to it, got to make sure that it's hot enough for the other glass to stick. All right, adding a little bit of clear glass to the bottom of that dragon's tail. It's a good indicator that we're getting ready to move this piece from the punty rod on which it sits to a new one so that we can work on the head and wings of this object. On the right-hand side of the studio, we've got one of our interns making that punty rod onto which this dragon will move. Meanwhile, here at the center bench, we've got Ben with the dragon form deep in that rewarming chamber. I'm going to bring those two items together. We'll attach that new punty rod to the tail. And on the other end, we'll use a set of shears to create some surface cracks. And then a quick tap of the rod will knock it away and leaving it in our intern's hands. We'll get back into the rewarming chamber to now heat up the coldest portion of that dragon form and bring it up to a working temperature. All right, folks, if you're just joining us here in studio, we're about halfway through the assembly process on this Dragon form. This Dragon form is going to serve as a stopper for our blue decanters here. They're going to be used later on in an event later this year. But the design element that they're working on is a Dragon form in the same color as the stem of that goblet. The hope is that we're able to tie those two elements together and present a cohesive product. All right, so now we've added the mane down the neck of our Dragon form. Again, back to that rewarming chamber, 2,300 degrees on the inside. Absolutely dry, minus, the pieces that may fall off occasionally. But there is no glass stored in that rewarming chamber. Lined with fire brick and runs on natural gas and forced air, and operates only for the time that we're here in the studio. If you contrast that with the crucibles, we have two of those here on the hot shop floor. One of them on the left-hand side of the studio is currently out of service, so we're working out of the right side only. Each one of our crucibles holds 1,000 pounds of glass, so that when we are up and running at full speed, we have a ton of liquid glass at any given time on our hot shop floor. And again, that runs at 2,100 degrees 24/7. A little bit of colored glass for the face. Again, using those tongs and tweezers. You get deep in there and create those design elements that really say Dragon. We've got the tray presented here to the center bench. Currently adding a couple of eyes to the Dragon. Those eyes were created earlier, and we keep them in this big silver box on the left-hand side of our studio called the garage. That garage holds our pieces and project parts at about 1,000 degrees, which means they're hot and ready to use, but they're not quite liquidy. They're not soft. So we've got to get them up to temperature, make sure that they bond to our glass form before we continue shaping up. So that's what we're doing now before we add our next bit. All right, with our intern pulling that gather of hot glass out of the crucible, running it through the frit, and now into the rewarming chamber, that tells me we're getting ready to add another bit. In this case, we'll be adding the first of our wings. So we'll move back to the bench, hold that punty rod vertically, apply the bit, and snip it away with those shears, and then emboss the surface of that wing with our tongs. And now back into the rewarming chamber, giving an all-over flash before we get back to the bench and finish refining that wing form we just added. And with the application of that MAP gas torch to the connection point and having that pan brought over here from our garage, it's a good indicator that we're getting ready to move this piece off of that pipe and put it away for the afternoon. Again, our garage sits at about 1,000 degrees on the inside, so it'll keep our glass items ready to use, but won't keep them so hot that they'll deform. So we get ready to break this away and put it away for the afternoon. Maybe use it a little bit later. And quick tap. And there we go, folks. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and take lunch now. We'll be back in just a little over an hour. We'll see you back here at about 2:15.